The first warning came as a routine transmission, filtered through layers of protocol and translated into calm diplomatic language before it ever reached Earth's public channels. And because of that calm wording, almost no one on the planet understood how serious it truly was. But inside the deep command chambers beneath Colorado, Admiral Richard Hale read the alien message in its raw form and felt the weight of something ancient and arrogant pressing down on humanity for the first time. The Empire of Karth declaring that the Sol system lay within its sphere of influence and that the human species, described as a minor industrial culture with limited interstellar reach and no demonstrated strategic value, would be required to submit to oversight, resource regulation, and military inspection, a polite way of saying occupation. And Hale, a man who had spent 40 years in uniform and had watched humanity claw its way from near-planetary wars into the quiet unity that made the first extrasolar colonies possible, knew that this was a moment every strategist secretly prepares for, but hopes never comes, the moment when an outside power looks at Earth and sees weakness rather than caution, potential rather than capability, and assumes that silence means fear and restraint means inability. And as he stood in the dim light of the operations center with holographic stars slowly rotating above him, he thought not of battles or ships but of history, of how often on their own world empires had mistaken patience for submission and paid for it in blood and ash. And when he spoke to the assembled council of generals, scientists, and civilian leaders, his voice was steady as he said that the Karth Empire had just made the same mistake. Though none of them yet knew how vast the price would be or how far across the galaxy its echo would travel, because at that same time, light years away in a massive orbital citadel built around a blue giant star, High Strategist Vorkith, the Karth reviewed intelligence summaries that painted humanity as a scattered, politically divided species with limited faster-than-light infrastructure and no proven experience against unified imperial fleets, and he allowed himself a slow, satisfied movement of his mandibles as he approved the deployment of a single pacification armada, not even a full war fleet, just enough to demonstrate force and secure compliance, confident that a show of power would be enough to bring the small, stubborn primates into line. And in his chambers, surrounded by towering holograms of conquered systems and long lists of client species, he spoke to his aides about efficiency and order, about how the galaxy ran best when lesser civilizations accepted guidance from those strong enough to impose it, and he dismissed the idea that humans might resist in any meaningful way, citing their limited territorial spread and lack of alliances, unaware that their very isolation had allowed them to build, in silence, to experiment without scrutiny, and to develop doctrines that assumed no one would come to help, doctrines built on self-reliance, redundancy, and the simple belief that if the universe ever did come knocking with hostile intent, humanity would answer with everything it had and everything it could become. And so when the first Karth ships emerged at the edge of the Sol system in a blaze of distorted space-time, their formation precise and overwhelming by the standards of most known species, the Empire expected panic, surrender, perhaps token resistance for the sake of pride. But what they encountered instead was something that did not fit their models. Because Earth did not rush to broadcast pleas or threats, did not scramble its fleets into visible defensive postures, did not even respond immediately at all. And that silence, interpreted by Karth analysts as confusion and fear, was in truth the sound of a civilization switching from peacetime habits to wartime focus, of command chains locking into place, of dormant systems coming online, and of plans that had been written decades earlier, when humanity had first realized that the universe was wide, old, and unlikely to be kind, now being pulled from secure archives and executed without hesitation. And as the Karth Armada advanced, confident and unchallenged, they were unaware that deep within the shadows of their own sensor range, human observation platforms were already tracking every vector, every energy, signature, every fluctuation in their shields and drives, feeding data into learning systems that have been trained not on known alien tactics, but on the assumption that the first true enemy would be unknown, overwhelming, and merciless, and therefore must be met with speed, adaptability, and the willingness to strike first when the moment came. And that moment was approaching, even if neither side yet understood how close it was or how completely it would shatter the Empire's belief that humans were weak. And as the Karth Armada continued its slow, deliberate advance toward the inner system, broadcasting formal declarations of authority in carefully translated phrases meant to impress and intimidate, the human response finally came, not in the form of surrender, but as a single, tightly worded message from Earth's unified council stating that no foreign power held jurisdiction over Sol, and that any attempt to enforce such claims would be considered an act of war, a statement that caused brief amusement among Karth officers who saw it as a predictable defiance of a species that did not yet understand its place in the galactic order. And so High Strategist Vorkith authorized the next phase, a demonstration strike, instructing his fleet to disable one of the outer human colonies to show the consequences of resistance, selecting the mining world of Ceres Station as a target because it lay on the edge of human-controlled space and appeared lightly defended and as Karth warships altered course, their drives flaring with controlled power. They remained unaware that every change in their formation was being mirrored by quiet adjustments in human battle plans, that beneath the surface of Mars, in the hollowed caverns of Luna, and in mobile command vessels drifting far beyond the orbit of Pluto, officers and analysts were watching in silence, not with fear, but with a cold, focused intensity born of generations who had learned that survival depended on preparation and when. The first Karth energy lances fired towards Ceres Station, cutting to the void with beams meant to cripple infrastructure and force capitulation. They were met by something the Empire had not expected, a sudden, precisely timed burst of defensive fire from platforms that had not been visible moments before, arrays of human-built weapons unfolding from what had appeared to be inert mining structures, their power output far exceeding what Karth intelligence had estimated possible for a so-called minor civilization. And the initial exchange did not destroy any major ships on either side, but it did something far more important. It shattered assumptions, because Karth sensors recorded shield harmonics and weapon signatures that did not match any known human designs, suggesting rapid adaptation and technological depth that their models had not accounted for. And in the flagship's command chamber, Vorkith felt the first stirrings of unease as reports came in describing human defensive coordination that rivaled that of long-established interstellar powers, yet pride and doctrine push him forward, interpreting this resistance as a localized anomaly rather than a sign of systemic strength. And so he ordered the Armada to press in, to bring overwhelming force to bear and end the matter quickly, unaware that this escalation was exactly what human strategists had anticipated, because for decades they had planned for the possibility that the first contact with a hostile Empire would involve probing attacks followed by a show of force, and their response doctrine was built around drawing such an enemy deeper, closer, into positions where the full complexity of human warfare could be revealed not all at once, but in layers, each one more unsettling than the last. And so as Karth ships advanced past the outer defensive ring, confident that they were breaking through the limited resistance of an inferior foe, they crossed an invisible threshold, entering A, battle space that had been quietly prepared with sensor ghosts, decoy signatures, and overlapping fields of fire designed to confuse, divide, and isolate. And it was there, in the cold darkness between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, that the Empire began to understand that the humans they had dismissed as weak had been watching, learning, and waiting, and that the price for underestimation was about to be paid not in concessions or tribute, but in ships, in crews, and in the slow, dawning realization that they had provoked a civilization that did not know how to surrender. And in the days that followed, as both sides repositioned and reinforced, the character of the conflict shifted from probing engagements to a full campaign, and it was during this phase that the Karth Empire's strategic assumptions truly began to unravel, because human forces did not concentrate solely on defending the inner worlds, as the Empire expected, but instead launched a series of coordinated strikes along the edges of Karth supply lines, attacks that were not aimed at dramatic destruction but at disruption, at forcing the Armada to burn fuel, expend munitions, and divert ships to protect logistics. And each of these actions was calculated with a precision that revealed a deep understanding of how interstellar empires sustain power, an understanding born from centuries of human history, in which wars were often decided not by single battles, but by the slow erosion of an enemy's ability to move, communicate, and resupply, and when Karth convoys began to suffer losses. To fast, hard-to-track human raiders that appeared struck and vanished before heavy escorts could respond. The strain on the Armada grew, and with it the strain on Vorkith's confidence, because the reports he now received spoke of human commanders anticipating Imperial responses, setting traps along likely pursuit routes, and using the vastness of space not as an obstacle but as a weapon, luring Karth ships into regions where sensor noise, gravitational anomalies, and carefully deployed Decoys created confusion that human pilots exploited with calm efficiency, and within the Empire's command structure, dissenting voices began to rise, officers who questioned the initial assessment of humanity as weak and urged a re-evaluation of strategy. But the weight of tradition and pride made it difficult for such warnings to gain traction, because to admit that a so-called minor species posed a serious threat was to admit that the Empire's intelligence apparatus and long-held doctrines had failed. And yet the evidence mounted, as more Karth vessels returned to fleet bearing the marks of weapons that cut through armor thought to be impervious, of electronic warfare techniques that penetrated systems believed secure, and of tactical maneuvers that demonstrated a level of creativity and initiative that rivaled the best Imperial commanders. And on Earth, as news of the conflict spread in controlled, carefully measured releases, the public did not react with panic, but with quiet, determined unity. Because for the first time in their history, humanity faced a threat that came not from another nation or ideology, but from beyond their world. And that shared danger erased old divisions, focusing attention on a single, clear objective, survival. And in shipyards orbiting Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies, production lines that had once built exploration vessels and commercial transports shifted to war output, turning out new hulls and upgrading existing ones with speed that surprised even human planners, while research facilities accelerated projects that had been considered experimental, integrating new propulsion methods, advanced shielding concepts, and autonomous support systems into the fleet. And all of this activity was coordinated through a command network designed to function even under heavy attack, decentralized enough to survive the loss of any single node, yet unified by a common doctrine that emphasized initiative, mutual support, and the willingness to take calculated risks. And as the human war effort gathered momentum, the Karth Armada found itself increasingly on the defensive, forced to react rather than dictate. And though the Empire still possessed numerical superiority and immense firepower, the balance of the campaign was no longer defined by raw strength alone, but by adaptability, by the ability to learn and change faster than the enemy. And in that contest, the humans, shaped by a history of constant struggle and innovation, were beginning to demonstrate why the Empire's belief in their weakness had been a catastrophic misjudgment. And as the campaign deepened, the Karth High Command authorized the commitment of their elite core fleets, formations that had crushed revolts and rival powers across dozens of systems, believing that the application of overwhelming, disciplined force would finally break the human resistance. And when these fleets entered the contested regions of soul space, their arrival was marked by vast energy signatures and tightly controlled formations that radiated confidence and experience. And for a brief moment, even some human observers felt the weight of that presence, the sense of facing an ancient, highly organized war machine. But the human response was not to retreat or to concentrate in a single defensive line. Instead, they executed a complex series of maneuvers that dispersed their forces, drawing the Karth core fleets into multiple overlapping engagement zones, each one chosen for its tactical advantages. Regions where gravitational gradients could be used to mask movements, where asteroid fields provided cover for ambush, and where prepositioned sensor arrays and weapon platforms created a layered battlespace that punished any ship that advanced without full situational awareness. And in these zones, the fighting intensified, with Karth battleships trading massive volleys with human capital ships whose designs emphasized modular systems and rapid repair, allowing them to absorb damage and remain in the fight. And while the Empire's vessels relied on thick armor and powerful shields, the humans employed a combination of precision strikes and electronic warfare to degrade those defenses, targeting power distribution nodes, communication relays, and sensor arrays, not always to destroy but to blind and disorient. And this approach, methodical and relentless, began to wear down the Karth formations, forcing them to operate with reduced coordination, and increasing the burden on individual captains to make decisions in rapidly changing conditions. And it was here that another difference between the two civilizations became clear, because while Karth doctrine emphasized strict adherence to hierarchical command and established tactical patterns, human doctrine encouraged initiative and flexibility, trusting trained officers and crews to adapt to unfolding situations without waiting for explicit orders. And this cultural difference translated directly into battlefield advantage, as human units exploited fleeting opportunities, coordinated ad hoc attacks, and withdrew before superior firepower could be brought to bear, slowly eroding the cohesion of the Imperial fleets. And within the command chambers of the Karth flagship, Vorkith and his staff now confronted a growing body of evidence that the humans were not merely resisting, but outmaneuvering them, using the Empire's own size and complexity against it. And when casualty reports and supply shortfalls began to intersect, revealing that losses were mounting faster than replacements could arrive from distant systems, the strategic picture darkened, because the campaign that had been expected to last weeks was stretching into months, and the political cost of such protracted conflict was rising within the Empire's core worlds, where resources and attention were now tied up in a war that was no longer seen as a simple exercise in enforcing authority. And still, despite these pressures, the order to withdraw or negotiate did not come, because pride and the fear of appearing weak before subject species drove the leadership to push on, convinced that one decisive blow would restore dominance, and that blow was planned in the form of a massive, coordinated assault on Earth itself, intended to demonstrate irrefutable superiority and force unconditional surrender. And as preparations for this operation began, the Karth commanders believed they were setting the stage for the end of the conflict, unaware that in doing so, they were walking into the most carefully prepared defense humanity had ever conceived, a defense built not only on weapons and ships, but on the collective determination of a species that had finally found its place in the universe and was prepared to defend it at any cost. And when the Karth Armada finally set its course for Earth, assembling its remaining strength into a single, immense spearhead meant to crush resistance in one overwhelming strike, human command did not react with visible panic or desperate last stands, but with a quiet, almost solemn precision, because this was a scenario their planners had always assumed would come of a hostile empire truly committed, the moment when the enemy would aim directly for political and symbolic heart of humanity. And so the layers of defense that had been built over decades were brought fully online, orbital platforms that had once been dismissed by alien observers as commercial infrastructure unfolded into massive weapons arrays, deep space sensor nets shifted into active targeting modes, and fleets that had been held in reserve at distant colonies began converging on Sol, not in a single mass, but in carefully timed waves designed to arrive at specific points in the coming battle. And on Earth itself, beneath oceans and mountains, command centers that had been constructed in secrecy activated redundant communication links, ensuring that no single strike could decapitate human leadership. And as the Karth spearhead advanced, their long-range sensors began to register an increase in human activity. Yet the pattern of that activity was difficult to interpret, because instead of forming a single defensive wall, human forces appeared to be dispersing, creating multiple clusters of ships and platforms spread across a wide volume of space, a formation that seemed to invite penetration. And Karth analysts, still influenced by the belief that humans lacked the capacity for sustained, large-scale coordination, interpreted this as disorganization, as a sign that the pressure of the campaign was finally fracturing their defenses. And so the order was given to push through, to drive straight toward Earth and ignore the scattered resistance. And it was at this point that the true shape of the human strategy began to reveal itself, because as the Imperial fleets advanced, the dispersed human groups did not attempt to stop them head-on. Instead, they began a series of synchronized actions that targeted the periphery of the Karth formation, striking at escorts, censorships, and command relays, not with the aim of immediate destruction, but of forcing the spearhead to tighten, to draw closer together for mutual protection. And as the Imperial ships closed ranks, their very density became a vulnerability, because the volume of space they occupied shrank, making them more susceptible to coordinated fire and to the effects of overlapping defensive systems that the humans had positioned along the likely approach vectors. And then, as the Karth fleet crossed a predetermined line in space, a region that human navigational charts marked as unremarkable, but which in reality had been seeded with dormant systems, the trap was sprung, as hundreds of previously silent platforms activated simultaneously, projecting fields that distorted local space-time and interfere with faster-than-light transition capabilities, effectively cutting off the Imperial fleet's ability to maneuver strategically or withdraw quickly. And at the same moment, human warships emerged from concealment at multiple angles, their arrival timed to the microsecond, and opened fire in coordinated salvos that targeted not just hulls, but the intricate web of energy distribution and command control that held the Karth formation together. And for the first time in the campaign, The Empire found itself not advancing into a weakly defended core, but caught in a deliberately constructed kill zone, where every movement was anticipated, every response met with counteraction, and every attempt to break out met with forces that had been waiting for that exact choice. And within the flagship of the Karth Armada, Vorkith watched the tactical display shift from confident advance to chaotic engagement, as icons representing his most powerful ships flickered with damage reports and communication delays. And in that moment, the full weight of his earlier misjudgment began to settle, because it was now clear that humanity had not been improvising under pressure, but executing a plan that had been prepared long before the first Imperial ship had ever entered Sol. A plan built on the assumption that the enemy would be stronger, more numerous, and convinced of its own superiority, and that such an enemy, once committed, could be drawn into a position where its strength became a liability rather than an advantage. And as the battle around Earth intensified, the scale of destruction and coordination reached levels that even seasoned car commanders had rarely witnessed, because human forces now committed their heaviest assets, massive carriers releasing waves of strike craft that moved with disciplined precision, capital ships coordinating fire through distributed command systems that allowed them to react as a single organism rather than as isolated units, and planetary defense arrays that reached far into space, their beams and kinetic projectiles forming overlapping fields that turn approach corridors into zones of lethal convergence. And within this maelstrom, the Karth spearhead began to fracture, not all at once, but through a series of cascading failures as damaged ships struggled to maintain formation, as command signals lagged or were lost entirely, and as the tightly coupled structure of the Imperial fleet, once its greatest strength, became a conduit through which disruption spread, and individual captains, trained to rely on clear hierarchical orders, found themselves forced to make independent decisions in an environment that punished hesitation, while their human counterparts, accustomed to decentralized command, exploited every opening with ruthless efficiency. And as the fighting raged, scenes of desperate courage and grim determination played out on both sides. Karth crews working to keep their vessels operational under relentless fire, human engineers rerouting power and sealing breaches as alarms echoed through their ships. And in the midst of this, the strategic picture continued to evolve, because the human objective was not merely to defend Earth, but to break the offensive capability of the Karth Armada, so completely that the Empire would be forced to reconsider its entire posture toward Sol and toward humanity as a whole. And so targeted strikes were directed at the heart of the Imperial formation, aiming to isolate and disable the command ships that coordinated the fleet. And when one such vessel suffered catastrophic damage and fell silent, the effect rippled outward, creating confusion and hesitation that human forces immediately exploited, pressing their advantage, tightening the noose, and as more car ships were forced into defensive postures or began to withdraw in disarray, the realization spread to the Imperial ranks that this was no longer a campaign that could be salvaged by a single decisive blow, that the humans they had once dismissed as weak had constructed a defense in depth, layered with redundancy and flexibility, and supported by an industrial and logistical base that could sustain high-intensity conflict far longer than anticipated. And within the shattered command structure, Vorkith struggled to impose order, issuing directives to regroup, to concentrate remaining strength, to prepare for a coordinated breakout from the kill zone. But each attempt was met by human countermeasures that anticipated likely escape routes and closed them off, forcing the Imperial ships into increasingly desperate maneuvers. And it was in this phase of the battle that the psychological dimension of the conflict became unmistakable, because the aura of inevitability that had once surrounded the Karth Empire began to fade, replaced by uncertainty and the dawning fear that they were not facing a minor civilization to be subdued, but a pure adversary, perhaps even a superior one in certain domains, a species that had turned its long history of internal conflict into a brutal education in the art of war, and now applied that education on an interstellar scale. And as the casualty list grew and the once orderly formations dissolved into clusters of damaged ships fighting for survival, the ultimate truth of the situation became impossible to ignore. The Empire had not merely miscalculated the strength of humanity. It had provoked a civilization that had prepared its entire future around the assumption that one day someone would come and try to take everything, and that on that day there would be no room for weakness, no room for doubt, only the will to endure and the resolve to make the cost of aggression so high that no one would ever make the same mistake again. And when the final phase of the battle unfolded, it did so not as a single climactic exchange, but as the steady, inescapable collapse of the Karth offensive, because the Empire's remaining ships, cut off from rapid retreat, low on coordinated command, and facing a defense that had anticipated every likely maneuver, found themselves forced into a series of localized fights that all ended the same way, with human forces isolating, surrounding, and disabling them in turn, and as the last organized. Pockets of resistance were reduced, the scale of the defeat became undeniable. The once proud spearhead that had set out to break Earth now scattered into drifting wrecks and surrendering vessels, their crews facing the reality that the campaign was lost, and in the flagship, Vorka stood before a tactical display that no longer showed a coherent formation, but a field of damaged icons, many of them dark, and in that moment, the full weight of the Empire's errors settled on him. Because he could now see the pattern that had been invisible at the beginning, the way humanity had allowed the Karth to advance, to commit, to overextend, and then had closed the trap with precision that spoke of long preparation and cold understanding. And when communications were finally reestablished with Earth's command, the message that came was not one of triumphal boasting, but a firm, unyielding clarity, stating that the attack on Sol had been repelled, that the Karth Armada had been neutralized, and that any further attempts to impose imperial authority would be met with the same or greater force. And for the first time in the history of the Karth Empire, an external power was not merely resisting, but dictating terms. And across the wider galaxy, as news of the battle spread through trade networks and diplomatic channels, the perception of humanity shifted with startling speed from a minor, isolated species to a rising power that had faced an ancient empire and not only survived but inflicted a decisive defeat, and among subject worlds and rival states alike. The implications were profound, because the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Karth was broken, replaced by the knowledge that their fleets could be stopped, their doctrines outmatched, and their assumptions proven fatally flawed. And on Earth, as the immediate danger passed, there was no celebration in the streets, only a quiet, collective understanding that a line had been crossed, that humanity was no longer hidden on the edge of the galactic stage, but had stepped into the light through fire and sacrifice, and that the future would now be shaped not by isolation, but by the knowledge that the universe was watching, measuring, and reassessing. And in that reassessment, one truth stood out with undeniable clarity. The Empire had thought humans were weak, and in acting on that belief, it had paid the ultimate price, not only in lost ships and shattered pride, but in the permanent loss of its unquestioned dominance, because the galaxy had learned and would not forget that beneath Earth's quiet exterior lay a civilization that could endure pressure, adapt with frightening speed, and respond to aggression with level resolve and capability that no one had expected, and that from this moment forward, any power that considered underestimating humanity would remember the fate of the Karth Armada and think twice before making the same catastrophic mistake.